Hello and welcome to a bonus episode of Crikey's Cut Through podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Andrews, and I'm here with political editor Bernard Keane. And BK, we came back to record because we made some people very, very upset with our most recent episode, which, if you haven't listened to it, was all about taking One Nation seriously, which unfortunately, and I do genuinely feel bad about this, many One Nation supporters did not welcome the discussion. They believed that we were calling them stupid, that we were calling them deplorables, to reference the 2016 Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump presidential campaign, and that we think that they are trash. It all stems from this one particular clip posted online where we discussed the demographic data and profile of One Nation voters. From your position as a political editor, how easy or difficult is it to take One Nation seriously right now?
That's really important, is to understand who One Nation supporters are. One Nation supporters are tend to be older males. They tend to live in regional Australia or at a pinch the outer suburbs. They tend to be poorly educated. Very few people with bachelor's degrees tend to support One Nation. They tend to be low income. They are broadly the category of people that have probably done the least best out of our economic reforms over the last 30 to 40 years. Where that rubs up against political reality is that there are only so many of those people.
BK, maybe we can just start here for the record. Do you think that One Nation voters and One Nation's new supporters are trash?
Well, I think a lot of people are trash, but I don't think voting intention is a very good guide to trashdom. There's a lot of trash about if you know where to look, but you won't really find it based on how people vote. I imagine there's a lot of trash among Labor voters and Green voters and Liberal voters and people who don't vote. I don't think that's really got anything to do with the personal qualities of people. It's less about what kind of people you are than your background and your experiences. And I think and what's important to you, what's a priority for you. I think that shapes how people vote, and that shapes how One Nation supporters vote every bit as much as it shapes what Labor or Greens or Liberal voters, how they express themselves at the ballot box.
Yeah, I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious here, but there is a conversation around whether it is mean or patronising or dismissive or, however else people may feel, to describe One Nation supporters in the way that the demographic data that we have available describes them. And this is an important point because that snippet of the previous episode was based on a profile from reputable polling companies about where those demographic points fall for who is likely to be a One Nation supporter. But if people feel offended by that, does that implicate the media discussions that we have around this? Does it implicate the political discussions that we have about this? How do we navigate that?
Well, no one likes being labelled. You could get a group of university professors in a room and say, well, we've looked at your demographics and your background, and we can, offer these sort of describe you in these particular ways, and they'd be every bit as annoyed, I imagine, as One Nation voters. It's just a natural human reaction. I think a lot of the pushback has really come around two particular aspects of the demographic data that's emerged about One Nation. And by the way, we've got three different kinds of demographic data about how different voters are lining up at the moment. And unless you think all voters are homogenous, clearly different kinds of voters are going to support different kinds of political parties. And a lot of it's just personal choice, but a lot of it is also to do with the kinds of people they are. So Demos AU is a pollster which has been breaking down demographics of voting intention for a while. So we were able to see from Demos AU what kind of characteristics there are. Red Bridge's poll that came out just earlier at the start of this week gave us additional information exactly along the same lines, what kind of demographics support One Nation. And Morgan polling was doing the same thing late last year. And all of these sources tend to give us very, very similar kinds of assessments of how the vote is splitting up according to demographics at the moment. But what's I think upsetting people is the fact that if you look at the education breakdowns and you look at the income breakdowns, you see that One Nation supporters have a much stronger representation of people without a Year 12 education or a TAFE education, and a very quite low representation of people with university degrees. It's also the case that people on low incomes are much more likely to be supporters of One Nation than people on higher incomes. Now, this isn't any different to the data that says older people tend to support One Nation rather than younger people, and that's very, very definitely the case. And that people living in sort of cities tend to be less supportive of One Nation than people living in regional areas. People, I guess, are much more sensitive and feel much more vulnerable when you talk about their level of education and their level of income compared to where they might live or how old they are. Society gives us some subtle or not so subtle signals about the link between intelligence and education, and we know that education isn't actually entirely or even maybe mostly to do with intelligence. It's about access to educational opportunities and resources. It's about family background. Kids who grow up in affluent areas in the eastern suburbs of Sydney and kids who grow up in regional Australia have access to radically different educational opportunities, even if they have exactly the same intelligence. So the idea that to point out that someone doesn't have a strong educational background, if people think there's some sort of suggestion that means they're dumb, well, clearly that's not the case. And the best demonstration of that is the fact that between the 1980s and now, Australia's level of higher education has dramatically increased. That's why about a third of the whole population now has a higher education degree. If you go down to younger cohorts, it's up above 50%. So we've had a radical increase in the level of higher education in Australia, but I don't think it's because there's been a radical explosion in IQs. It's because we've made education available to people. Or governments have decided to do that. So let's not get bogged down in the idea that pointing out people have lower education is somehow suggesting they're stupid. What it's really suggesting is they're not given access to the same opportunities as a lot of people, and that's why I think we do see people in regional areas tend to have lower levels of education, regardless of how they vote. There might be Nationals voters, there might be One Nation voters, there might be Labor voters, but they don't have access to the same level of services. As across health and education and social services. So it's about probably some of the very issues that One Nation is kind of trading off, which is the dearth of city-like services being made available to people, to communities in regional areas, and the resentment about that.
Yeah, there's a couple of things in there that I think are quite interesting when we talk about these sorts of demographic characteristics. It's the overlap of those that helps to create the whole picture. So exactly as you're saying, when you consider that Australia now has much higher levels of higher education, the fact that One Nation supporters were both more likely to be older and have lower levels of university education, those two things map onto each other. And then again, when you overlay it with the fact that they are more likely to be living in regional areas, this creates, a clearer picture of what's going on. No polling company is ever going to be able to poll every single person who would vote or intend to vote for a certain party exactly what their situation is, but it just creates a picture of what's more likely rather than less likely, and it is taking all of those factors and layering them over each other, which I think is important, and sometimes a lot of people miss when they just kind of cling on to one characteristic that they don't like. I think there's also a really interesting dynamic where we did not say in the podcast that it was a bad thing to not have a higher education. We certainly didn't call anybody stupid, but the reaction from those supporters ascribing negativity to a demographic characteristic that they also accept represents them. We had a lot of people saying, I don't have a university education and I live in the regions and I'm smart and will show them. Well, that is what we said that One Nation supporters are. And so there's an element of self-identifying with these characteristics, but also assuming that people are discussing those characteristics in an exclusively negative way, which I found very interesting. I also think it's worth pointing out that Pauline Hanson herself shared some of the polling data from, I think it was Demos AU. So, the data is good enough for Hanson herself to say that this has validity. So it is, I think, interesting to me that on one hand, it can be like, well, the polling data is wrong about who we say is supporting One Nation, but at the same time, the polling data is correct that there is more of us than ever before.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember what we're trying to do, which is work out what's really going on in the body politic. And we don't, yes, pollsters don't ring up everyone. They ring up a small subset of the population, and then they extrapolate using pretty rigorous methods to give us a picture. And they come with margins of error, but you can see across multiple data sets the kinds of trends. And it's important to get an understanding of, when there's a big shift going on, and this is the biggest shift I think we've seen in quite some time. It's really important to know what's driving it. And the first step in doing that is finding out who's shifting. And then you can start to work out, well, what's going on? And look, One Nation, right from its inception, going back right to Pauline Hanson, before she even set up One Nation in the 1990s, One Nation and Pauline Hanson have always attracted a support from older males and regional areas. That's always been the case, going back, nearly 30 years. And it doesn't surprise me that we're kind of seeing a new, permutations of that continuing to play out. But clearly, whatever she's doing now is much more successful than what she was doing in the 1990s. She's striking a chord that she didn't strike back then. So yeah, it is important to look at, well, is she just appealing to the same kind of demographic? Is that demographic changing? What's going on to drive this level of support? And that's the first step in trying to understand that, is investigating the polling data. Yeah, you can do a lot with this data to kind of look at what's driving people. And it's pretty clear that when it comes to, say, migration, which is a big issue in Australian politics at the moment, maybe it's not so much about the economics. It's not so much about the housing or access to services, that it's more about status, and it's more about identity, and it's more about nostalgia. And ultimately, it's more about people feeling like they, don't belong in their idea of Australia. Their idea of Australia is different to what they see as the reality of Australia in the second quarter of the 21st century. They don't like it.
Before we get into that part of the discussion, which I have a really pressing question for you on that. What a lot of people were saying was, I know people who are in the suburbs, I know people who are in the city, I know people, in the centre of Melbourne who support One Nation. I know a person with a PhD who's going to vote One Nation at the next election. People like to bring up these anecdotes and these individual stories to kind of say that you were wrong, to put it quite frankly. Why are those anecdotes so appealing to people, and how do they factor in?
So yeah, so two things. One is, for every I know someone who's got a university education and they support One Nation, and look, the Regis Professor of History at Cambridge University is a One Nation supporter. So you're wrong. Those people have one vote. They're not statistically significant. What we've seen from all this polling data, and the stuff that makes Pauline Hanson so happy, is we are seeing tens, hundreds of thousands of people switch their support to One Nation. So, it's a live question as to what those people look like. And, that's why we go back to the evidence. And the evidence says they're more likely to be this, and this. The single individual example doesn't matter. It is the big numbers that count. Big numbers are what get people elected. Big numbers are what determines who becomes Prime Minister. And the polling is about the big numbers. It's not about the individual example. And my uncle's mate is this and that. That's not particularly helpful. But second point, most ordinary people elevate anecdotes above hard data. Anecdotes are kind of stuff that you feel much more immediately connected to. So if your brother votes One Nation and, he did a bachelor's degree and whatever, that's something that directly. versus some, so-called expert, producing so-called evidence based on polling. And, I don't know anyone who's ever been polled and who believes all that stuff anyway, and the polls are always wrong. And, this is pretty standard stuff. There's a famous line from Michael Gove, the UK politician, during the Brexit debate, who said people have had enough of experts. When the experts were saying back then, Brexit's going to be a disaster for the UK economy. Predictions have turned out to be absolutely right, and in fact, if anything, they understated the economic damage that was going to be done. But it was all about how people felt. It was their personal experience that they might have gone down the high street and seen too many people from Europe on the high street. That was what Brexit was about, not people producing rigorous evidence to say that, well, in fact, you're actually better off with Brexit. And I think the same, similar things playing out here. And that's why, I talked about the migration example. I don't think you're going to convince too many One Nation supporters that migration is really good if you show them all the economic data that shows that Australia is actually better off with migration. It's not about that. It's about identity. And in many ways, this preference for anecdotes over data is about identity as well. It's about what you feel and what you feel personally connected to and what you know, not external evidence that you can't personally vouch for. It's a classic right-wing line that's arisen in recent years, which is do your own research. The irony of that is that's basically an invitation to actually dismiss research and just go with how you feel, because that's more immediate and real than some peer-reviewed study that passes the standard for scientific proof. I remember when I was campaigning against Sydney's lockout laws many years ago, and I was pointing to all this information, all this data that showed the whole thing was being beaten up by newspapers, and people would respond in the comments in crikey, yeah, but I know someone who got attacked while they were out at night in Sydney. And that, that from their view, that completely demolished any argument based on facts, because they knew someone who got punched. So you really can't respond to that in any meaningful way other than to say, well, people who make policy and who make decisions that affect all of us have got to kind of do it on a rigorous basis. You can't just do it based on, what happened to your mate or, some personal anecdote. You got to base it on something, a bit more rigorous and contestable and verifiable than an anecdote.
This brings it all really back to the challenge, not just for Crikey, but all media right now, mainstream, independent, big, small, whoever it is that's trying to do any sort of political analysis and commentary on where we are now. Something that, One Nation supporters say all the time is that they feel alienated and they feel abandoned by the political system. Like you've just said, I think that identity plays a really big part in that, how they see themselves and how they see the identities of those who they believe are being uplifted by the political system and the political players that we have right now. The tricky part for media is, how do you discuss what I think is a very understandable grievance, a dissatisfaction with politics, that feeling of abandonment, if you can't talk about the identity of the people who are feeling aggrieved, and if you can't label it as grievance or dissatisfaction, like, where does that leave us? How are we actually able to discuss this particular cohort of people and what they say, what they believe they are trying to do within this political system?
A persistent theme throughout all this, and whether we're talking about people who supported Donald Trump in the US, or One Nation supporters here, or dare I say, voters in the UK who are supporting reform there. I've long argued there is a clear link between the processes of the social and economic impacts of market-based economies from the 1980s onwards on particular groups of people, particularly people who did well under what you might call the old system, the pre-1980s, much more Keynesian, much more interventionist economies. They tended to be blue-collar men. Across the West, manufacturing industries were protected that employed mainly blue-collar men. We had systems of social status and privilege that elevated men blue collar and otherwise, to a higher status than everyone else, and that's all been under pretty relentless attack since the 1980s via things like anti-discrimination laws and concept of basically equal opportunity for everyone, and economic changes that have shifted us away from the kind of 1970s economic models toward a much more open, much more competitive type of economy. And all of that has been to undermine the status and the economic fortunes of particular groups of people and the people who depend on them. So the Australian economic story since the 1980s has been manufacturing's gone from being a really big part of our biggest employer to being an also ran. That's been that started in the 1980s, but it was still going on in the early 2010s when we had a mining investment boom that pushed the Australian dollar over parity with the US dollar and smashed our manufacturing exports. We've been picking up the pieces on manufacturing ever since. So that's been a long-going process. We've moved to a much more service-based economy. A subset of that has been the rise of health and caring services, which are strongly feminized. We've become a much more competitive trade-based economy. Our level of exports now as a proportion of our economy is so much greater than it was in the 1980s. And economically, we rely more heavily on our extractive industries as well, which are very low employment. Mining extractive industries are immensely high tech. They employ very few people. They are enormously productive. And Australia's economy has become more dependent on those as time has gone on. We make so much money from not just iron ore exports, but coal and gas as well. So our modern economy is far more. It employs it needs far fewer workers of a particular kind than it did in the 1980s, and it needs a lot more workers of another kind than it did in the 1980s. And the losers from that radical change in our workforce have mainly been blue collar men in regional areas, men who probably grew up. Their dad probably worked in a local cement factory, and that was a good job, and that was a good they were probably part of the union that paid well, and they gave them a good quality of life. Those sort of jobs have disappeared. The status that went with both being a white male and having a good solid job have been undermined. We've moved to an economy that's much more dependent on migration because we don't have enough skills, and that needs very, very different skills to what we used to have. So my argument has long been, and it's strengthened by the data that we've been talking about, is that the people who are supporting One Nation really are the victims of 40 years of economic and social change. Now, I think it's really important to acknowledge that if we're going to understand what's driving all this, because they feel disenfranchised by a system that has, in a way, turned its back on them and basically said, look, you're just going to have to compete and you're just going to have to do your best. We're not going to look after you anymore. Now, where the problematic bit gets to is, well, what does that say about those individual people that they end up supporting a Pauline Hanson, or in the case of the US, they supported Donald Trump? Do you sit in judgment about their decision to support someone like that? Do you sit in judgment on their resentments? Do you say, oh, they're angry at the world, they're angry at women, they're angry at people who are successful in the modern market-based economy? Do you judge their resentments, or do you try to understand their resentments? And I found a lot of this when the Hillary Clinton deplorables things, a classic example of you sitting in judgment on people's resentments and thinking rather than trying to understand it. And I think there's a lot of people on the left who just think, if you vote for Donald Trump or you vote for Pauline Hanson, you are just reflexively beyond the pale. You're a sexist or you're a racist, and how can you do that? And there's no hope for you. I think that's both too reductive and ultimately not very helpful for our democracy. If we're going to have a democracy, it means you've got to get along with people that you radically disagree with. there's always going to be people that we don't want participating in our democracy. Nazis, extremists of any kind who don't believe in democracy, who want to undermine democracy and use violence. But you've got to rub along in a democracy with people that you disagree with, sometimes strongly disagree with. No one enjoys it, but that's part of democracy. So, if you don't make the effort to understand why people are supporting a figure like Pauline Hanson, then you for a start, you're not a very good political strategist or a political commentator. But secondly, I think that acts to kind of dismiss these people out of hand. And I don't think they should be dismissed out of hand. You can't dismiss them out of hand. They've got a vote. They got one vote. And if there's, 500,000 of them wanting to vote for Pauline Hanson, then, you can't just wave that away. So, let's be realistic and try to engage with what's actually driving this rather than, engaging in name calling. And if people do think that by pointing out that, that there is a higher proportion of poorly educated people amongst One Nation supporters than in other groups, if they do think that was a kind of a version of saying that they were deplorable, well, it's not. I think we owe it to people to be, fact-based and rigorous about what's driving the biggest movement in Australian politics in recent years, I think.
I do think it's interesting that a lot of the leftward shift in politics in Australia as well is actually speaking to exactly the same issues as what those who, support Pauline Hanson, the people that we've been talking about today, would say their primary concerns were making sure that the economy is fair to all people, about getting rid of corruption in politics, big business influence in politics. Like, I think a lot of those things are shared throughout the spectrum. There is a lot more in common than maybe people would care to admit. But certainly for political journalists, for political commentators, I mean, we can't not talk about these things. And if people don't like it, so be it. There are a lot of political podcasts out there that you can listen to, a lot of political commentators out there that you can listen to that will tell you exactly what you want to hear. And I don't think that's what we're trying to do here on Crikey at all. And I don't think that's what we do.
I think if you're looking to have your views confirmed by us or be told something that you already agree with, then I'm not your chap, and I don't think anyone else at Crikey is your chap or your lady. And look, to be fair to other commentators, I think there is a widespread interest in what's driving this change because it is so dramatic, and we've got to explore it. And I think one of the things Anthony Albanese has tried to do is give voters a sense that governments can be trusted more. They will use the levers of power to try to make the economy work better for Australians. I don't agree with many of the decisions that they've made in that context, but I can see the logic that's driving them. I can see the logic of why they don't want to do anything particularly ambitious, because they're worried that that's going to make people trust governments less. That's I think it's important to recognise that there is, in at least one of the major parties, a recognition that we've got to kind of tackle this alienation and resentment. It is incumbent on the people who are actually in power, which doesn't cover Pauline Hanson and is probably never going to encompass Pauline Hanson, to address these kind of resentments and feelings of alienation. And we just got to look to the United States to see what happens if you don't.
Indeed. Well, thanks for the additional record this week, BK. I will let you get back to reading all those hate tweets, which are probably still coming through thick and fast.
Oh, it's a lot of fun.
If you enjoyed this episode of Cut Through, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating or review for the podcast. Crikey is 100% independent, which means your support powers our journalism.